Alright, welcome to the DHCP portion of this curriculum, and this is actually where we start actually making the network itself, and this is also where we can actually start communicating with our other devices, in this case their VMs, but this is where, the lights start to turn on. So first we got to talk about DHCP and make sure that we actually understand what this is and what we're trying to accomplish. So if we come over here, high level overview for DHCP is that DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. And what this does is it automatically assigns IP addresses to our clients that request them. The request, better known as DORA, is essentially the client going, I need an IP address. So let's go over that a little bit more detailed. So DORA, so D for discover, is the client essentially going, is there a DHCP server? And then if there is, can I have an IP address? And then once that DHCP server actually responds, they're going to respond with an offer going, yes, we have an IP address here. Do you want this one? One thing to note before we move on any farther is that whatever DHCP server responds first is the one that's going to give out the IP address. So occasionally it might be a little odd, especially if you have like domain trust going on, that a different DHCP server that you were expecting that didn't respond, or that you got an IP from a DHCP server that you weren't expecting, like in a different domain that you have trusted, might be a little odd and something to look into. And it's something that you should be aware of. Yes, you might get an IP address, it might even be in the right range, but if it came from the wrong DHCP server, what you were expecting, that might be something to look into. So let's move back to the original point. O for offer, that DHCP server, whatever one responds first, is going to offer a IP. So yes, we have an IP, here you go, do you want this one? The client is going to go, yes, I do, and they call it request here. Yes, I do, I want this IP address, please give it to me. And then that request is going to go back to the DHCP server. It is going to it's going to take away the access to that IP and then give it to the client that requested it. And this is known as a acknowledgement, essentially sending a packet back to the client stating that, yes, this is the IP address that you now have. So with that out of the way, we need to talk about DHCP leasing as well. So after the DORA request is done, you need to think about your IP like a car lease. So essentially what's going to happen here is after a certain amount of time, whatever you set your domain or your IP addressing lease expiring at half of that time, your client is going to reinitialize that lease. So this is where the analogy breaks down a little bit. If you can keep that IP address, you're going to, as a client, unless there's a reason to get a new one. You're going to keep the same IP address unless something changed on the network. If you get to 87.5% of that time for that DHCP lease, there's going to be a new DORA request, and the reason why this happens is because it's assumed that the DHCP server that the client got the original lease from is no longer active. So at that point, it essentially is going, okay, the old server that I had is not responding. I need a new IP address from a new DHCP server. And then your client's going to send out a new DORA request, and then hopefully the DORA request is responded to, and then if not, you know that you got a problem. So again, just like the last presentation, we're going to go over a series of screenshots just to show you one, the procedure, but two, to make sure that you guys are on the right path when we're doing this in person, and then as a reference as well. So we're going to have to install the DHCP role. So we're going to go to add roles and features. We're going to go to role-based features again. There's going to be a very similar process for every other role that we're going to install. Okay, we got Bahamut Final Fantasy here and server selection. Okay, standard procedure as before. And then once that is installed, we're going to go to DHCP, and then we're going to configure it. So we got more this time, and notice that we don't have any link down here like we did last time in the last presentation. So we have more here. You can do that here, or you can come up here to the little flag with the exclamation triangle thing. So let's go ahead and do that. Complete DHCP configuration. All right. Use the following credentials. We're going to use admin for this. Okay. Bahamut. Okay. We're going to come down here to DHCP manager. New scope. Well, make sure you're on DHCP, and then we're going to click on this IPv4, which I overlooked for a second, and then new scope. After new scope, we're going to make sure that we have our scope name, IP address range, length, which we're just going to use a 255.255.255 for a subnet mask. Okay, going to come down after we're done with those options. We're going to come down to scope, configure options, router, make sure that we add our proper router. So this is one thing that is going to be a little confusing because we're in a virtualized environment. There is no default routing in VirtualBox and VMware Player for that matter. You can add pfSense. However, you can communicate with that router, but it's not going to be able to change networks because it has no way of connecting to a different virtual switch because there is only one. Okay, and I tried to fix that when I was creating this curriculum, and I wasn't able to do so. So when I have more time, I might be able to find a solution to that, but for the time being and for this course, we're not going to be using a router. So we can add this. DNS server. Okay. DNS domain name. I'm going to activate here. And then we're going to make sure that the client actually has an IP address that makes sense. Okay, so that is the end of that slideshow. So we're going to come down here. Same procedure as before in terms of how everything is set up. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add a role and feature. Installation type, server selection, Bahamut Final Fantasy. Here we go. We need DHCP, so that is this one. Add features, continue. Okay, next. DHCP server, next. Restart if you need to. Install. Okay, so we're done here. We're going to come to our flag here because it's a little shorter. We're going to complete the DHCP configuration, description, authorization, make sure we're using that admin account. Okay, close. So that now should be active. Now we got to go and actually configure our scope. So if we come over here, DHCP Manager, I right-clicked on that blue bar. Okay. Here we go. We're going to open up this. We are going to open up this for the sake of demonstration. I'm going to right-click on that IPv4. I'm going to come down to New Scope. Here we go. We're just going to call this Final Fantasy FF DHCP scope. standard scope for description. And the range that we're going to use is a private address, just in case you have any mistake and you do like a NAT addressing thing. So you don't, well, I guess you could still get out with NAT addressing, but it gives us a little bit more flexibility in terms of if you made a mistake network-wise, you don't have, like you did an IP sweep of everything, you're more than likely you're going to be okay. But enter the range of the scope. So starting address 192.168.1.2. Then come down here 192.168.1.254. Nope. 254. Okay, so that mask is correct. Alright, so for exclusions, what we're going to end up doing is excluding 20 to 30 for any type of server that we want on the network that is going to obviously be a service or a role. So this would be like a DNS server or a file server or anything else that would be accessible network-wide that we don't necessarily want on DHCP. So what we're going to do is exclude 192.168.1.20, and then that ending exclusion is going to be 192.168.1.30, and then we're going to add this, and make sure you actually add it, because if you don't, then the exclusion is not going to go in. So we're good there. I'm going to hit next. Okay, 8 days is the standard for this. We're good with that. So, and that's the leasing duration. And then configure DHCP. Yes, I want to configure these. Default router. Okay. We don't have one, so we can skip that. If there's an error later on, we can fix it then. So parent domain, finalfantasy.com. We're good with that. Okay, Win server we don't have. Activate scope now. Yes. Okay. So now that we have that, we have a couple configurations that we have to do in VirtualBox itself. So let's go ahead and pull up this. So now that we actually have a domain, we need to make sure that our network cards, virtual ones of course, are on that domain. So if we come over here, settings, network, instead of host adapter, we need internal network, and instead of intranet, Final Fantasy.com. Okay, let's open up advanced here. We want to deny promiscuous mode as well. So there's that. We're going to click OK here. We are going to do the same thing for the rest of these. So internal network, finalfantasy.com. Okay, and before I change this on group 2C2, I'm going to come over here and show you what that IP address is before we actually get it from DHCP. So, CMD, IP config, F config, there we go. And notice that our IP address is 192.168.56.109. So, in a second here, I'm going to show you that that is going to change. Now, over here, one of the network cards that I've already changed, IP config 169.254.3.241. That is not correct. That is not what we gave it. We also are not getting the domain name. So let's go ahead and restart this real quick, because that might be the problem. And one of the things I try to strive for in my classes is that I like having these mistakes built into the videos in the class, just because it shows the students that, yes, I might be standing up here in front of you, but I too also make mistakes, but your job really is not avoiding mistakes, but just troubleshooting your way through them. So we should have got a do you want to be discoverable message. CMD ipconfig, still a problem. Okay, let's come over here, settings, network, internal network, finalfantasy.com. Okay, so while we're at it, I have a feeling that DNS is playing a role here. So let's go ahead and install that. So here's DNS. When I do the 168, okay. Oh, no, over here. Let's change this. Yeah, the problem seems to be that none of the clients could actually get to this server. There we go. So let's go ahead and do that. ipconfig, that is still a thing. So we'll restart here. Okay, still a problem. Okay, what we're doing now is installing DNS just to make sure that DNS is actually not the problem. So DNS server is already installed, so that is not it. Okay, DHCP, let's go ahead and make sure that everything was actually initialized. The other thing that we can do is make sure that our IP address is also static. So we're going to come over here, we're going to search for control panel. Okay, control, network internet, should be this one, yep, change adapter settings, there's that, properties, we're going to come down here to IPv4. Now I'm going to set a static IP address, and we're going to set it to 20, like this. Subnet should be the 255, which it is. Default gateway we don't need, and then preferred DNS is 192.168.1.20. So there's that. We're setting that IP address to make sure that we're actually in the correct network. Okay. There is that. Let's try this one again. Okay, that is still not working. So we're going to ping. This is probably not going to work because we're not in the right network. Yeah, general communication failure. Okay. So let's come back over here to VirtualBox. Settings. Okay, internal network. No, that is what I want. So there is that. Let's come back over here. Network, internal network, okay. Deny, okay. Okay, let's restart one more time with this. Okay, so notice that we have Final Fantasy now. We have 192.168.1.2, which is the first IP in that lease range that we had. And then we don't have a default gateway because we didn't give it one on the DHCP server. So this is working. So if I come back over here to Fran, ipconfig, okay, we're on a very different network for 56.109. Okay, so if I come back over here, cmd, ipconfig, okay, so we got one here, cmd, ipconfig, this is working as well, and then I'm going to change this last one over here, back to internal network, change this to Final Fantasy. Come on. There we go. And there we go. We got an IP address for group 2, client 2. And essentially what was happening there for the mistake that I made a mistake twofold, actually. One, that this server, domain controller 1, didn't have the correct domain or the NIC card settings needed for VirtualBox, and then I needed to make sure that all these other clients were on the same thing as well. Oh, and I didn't have a static IP either for this domain controller, because the domain controller itself would have taken from the DHCP list. So there's that. We have fixed that mini problem. So that's going to wrap it up for this video, and I will see you in the next one.